Hey everybody, welcome in. Thanks for carving out time in your day. We've got a lot of good material to get through, and just really glad you're here. I'm gonna pop in a little icebreaker poll just to feel free to answer this icebreaker while you're settling in. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Samadi Thomas. I'm with Change Research. Today we're going to walk through the South in numbers. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we dive in. This session is being recorded. So if you need to step away or you want to revisit something later, you'll be able to rewatch this webinar. And if you have any questions as we go through the presentation today, feel free to drop them using the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. We'll get to as many questions as we can before we wrap up. We'll go to the next slide. So while a few more folks fall in, let's do a quick icebreaker. So take a look at this list of different values, things like community, equality, faith, family, freedom, and tell us what you think matters most when it comes to keeping a local community strong. Just select your answer in the poll, and in a few slides, we'll compare that to what actual Southern voters told us. Go to the next one. So, for anyone that hasn't worked with us before, just quick background. We started Change Research back in 2017 because we wanted public opinion research to be faster and more accessible. What makes us a little different is how we build how we field our surveys. We use a multimodal method that combines social media ads and text outreach so that way every poll goes to fresh respondents instead of the same recycled group of people. Today's project is just a good example of that approach in action, done in partnership with E Pluribus Unum Institute. Go to the next one. So, a quick round of introductions. Mike Greenfield is our co-founder and CEO. He couldn't make it live with us today. Jessica Make It Mason is our senior analyst and did a lot of the heavy lifting on this research. I'm Samadi Thomas. I work on research and communication strategy here at Change Research, and um, we also have Scott Hutcheson here, who is the executive director of E Pluribus Unum Institute and a partner on this project. So here's what Southern voters actually told us when we asked this question. Let me share the results to everybody. Respondents in the survey were able to choose three values when it comes to maintaining strong local communities. And we see that family comes in at top at 39%, quality right behind at 38%, and honesty at 36%. But really hold on to all of this because Jessica will be going into a deeper dive on this question later in this presentation. Um, Before I hand it off to our presenters, here's how we'll spend our time. Um, we're going to start with some background on E Pluribus Unum Institute and why they wanted this research done. And then Jessica will walk us through what we found, the economic challenges and opportunities Southerners are facing now, how people think about core values and community, how they're getting information and staying engaged. We'll also have plenty of time at the end for your questions, so be sure to send those in. And with that, Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sumati. It's so nice to be here today. First, I'm thrilled to be able to share some of the work that E Pluribus Unum has done, but we couldn't have done it without our friends at Change Research because when we were founded in 2018, we needed to understand where an organization like E Pluribus Unum, which was created to work around exclusion, fragmentation, lack of trust in institutions, things that really embed inequity and some of the systemic issues that the South has faced, we needed to understand how that showed up in the South. And so for about 5 years now, we have been working with Jessica mainly on creating an instrument that helps us understand and not just assume where people stand on issues that keep communities divided and people with a lack of opportunity. And so, over the past 5 years, the world has changed in a number of different ways. And so, what she's going to share today is our survey of the South, which is a survey that covers all 13 states that we work in and helps us get a snapshot of what people are thinking, where attitudes are sitting across these 13 states. And that informs really every bit of our work. And what's been great about being able to do this over the past 5 years with them is that we've created a sort of longitudinal, and I know, Jessica, the scientifically it's not necessarily longitudinal, but for us it is. For the lay people like me who have to build around it, I can see changes over the years and understand how we can be more effective in our work, which is to bring communities together and help them work on issues that keep them divided from the ground up within communities. We don't fly in with this information and decide what communities should do. It's knowledge for us to understand how our work can become more effective, but also to be able to share those findings with people so they can see where progress can happen and where their fears are justified and sometimes where they're not. And that can change narratives and change relationships along the way. So this work has been invaluable to us. I hope you enjoy learning about it and some of the nuances that we try to get to with this data collection. And if you have any questions, I'll be here at the end to answer how we use this information. So, Jessica?
Thank you so much, Scott. So, yeah, I'm really excited to be sharing with you our most recent iteration of the survey of the South that we've done with E Pluribus Unum. What you'll see throughout this survey is we surveyed just over 1,900 white, Black, and Hispanic registered voters. And what we tried to do is get a minimum N size of 600 in each of those groups. So, at least 600 white voters, 600 Black voters, and 600 Hispanic voters. So, we could take a look at each of those samples individually and really understand those groups in conversation with each other. Um, when we are looking at these three populations, one of the first things we wanted to identify is the current landscape of challenges and opportunities that Southerners face. And it may not be surprising in the larger national conversation about economic hardship, but we're seeing when we ask voters to identify some of the biggest challenges in their communities, it's consistently economic issues. So we see that across all three groups of voters that we sampled, the cost of housing and rent becomes one of the most prominent challenges, followed by the cost and quality of healthcare. And we're seeing this pretty unified across these two groups. However, at the same time, we do start to see differences across these three racial ethnic groups that we were surveying, which has been very important to EP's work. Most notably, when we ask about the topic of racism and discrimination, we see that Black voters, 36% of them, select this as a top issue, rivaling cost and quality of healthcare, where for white voters, that just doesn't hold the same water. Similarly, we asked a more specific question about the pressure of economic opportunities, and we do see that there are a similar constellation of challenges that all of these groups in the South are facing, primarily high cost of living. But we're also seeing a lack of high-paying jobs being something, and health conditions or disabilities. But I think what's also really important to note is that access of economic opportunity is unevenly distributed. We see that 3 in 10 of our white voters say that they have no barriers to economic opportunity. That's just over 10 points higher than their Hispanic and Black counterparts. We also asked an open-ended question of these folks, whether they feel better off or worse off than others in their local community. And we saw when we were looking at the open ends and doing the analysis, a little less than half believe that they're better off, about a third say they're doing worse off, and the remainder say that they're doing about the same. However, in both sets of open ends, the better offs and the worse offs, there is a constant tone of financial instability and financial stress. Something that really spoke to me is one of the quotes that we have here highlighted in blue is that one woman says that she's doing better off than her neighbors because she makes a living wage in a low income area. So there is this really stark sense of economic distress across sort of all sections of voters that we're seeing here. We also see that voters demonstrate a notable lack of trust when it comes to government problem solving. So, after identifying those top issues, we then asked these voters how much do they trust the local government to address the top issues that they chose. And we're seeing that pretty universally there is majority distrust, with folks in barely the 10% range saying that they trust their governments strongly to address these community issues. We also see that majorities of Southern voters are holding this mindset that some people will be left behind when it comes to the question of opportunity, and they view opportunity as almost a zero-sum game. So one of the first things we see is that a really notable majority agree with the statement. Moving forward, some groups will have access to fewer opportunities in the United States, and just over half, 55%, say creating opportunities for one group of people often occurs at the expense of other groups. In the next slide, I actually break this out by our 3 different samples, and what we're going to see is that voters across the different racial and ethnic identities share a similarly negative view on this access to opportunity. The only difference here is that we have this group of white voters where we see 51% say today in America, it seems that the rights of Americans of color are better protected than the rights of white Americans. Only 20% of their Black counterparts believe the same thing. But something that I think is especially important to know as we dive into the data further is when we're looking at our white voters, the perceptions of equity, of opportunity, are inherently partisan. So, what I did here is break out our white Democrats from our white Republicans, and we see 2 very different stories in a way that we don't see in our Hispanic or Black sample. So, for example, what we're seeing is minorities of white Democrats hold this opinion of creating opportunities for one group occurs at the expense of other groups. White Republicans are quite the opposite there. Same thing when we have this statement about today in America, it seems that the rights of Americans of color are better protected than the rights of white Americans. Only 12% of white Democrats agree with this statement compared to 72% of white Republicans. I will note that for a lot of this survey and a lot of this data, we really strayed away from using a partisan frame. So this is one of the few times we do bring it up because it is so obvious. But what we'll also find is that there are a lot of other identity markers that also cover color and inform the Southern voter experience. And one of the ways that we can unlock that experience is through further diving in to Southern voters' core beliefs and the way that they build community. So one of the first things we asked, we saw this as our icebreaker question, is what are the 3 values that they see as the most important for maintaining strong local communities? And we see a pretty notable division between the 2 top values of family and equality. So when we're looking at our total respondent pool, that's at 39% for family, 38% for equality, basically neck and neck. And we see that for white voters, there's a slight a slight edge for family as a top value for Black voters. There's a slight edge for equality as a top value. And then in our Hispanic voter group, it's just a 2% difference, really, again, divided. But what I decided to do is we asked a question about different activities that voters participate in, one of those being religious life. And when we look at our three different voter groups by whether or not they are active in religious life, we see a very different picture. So when we look at our white group, for example, those who are religiously active are much more likely to identify family as a top value versus equality. But that picture flips for those who are not religiously active. 33% say family, but 37% say equality. The same trend happens among our Hispanic voters, but in our Black voter groups, regardless of whether they are active in religious or faith activities or not, equality still holds as a top value for those groups. We also ask this question about central markers of identity, asking folks how important are each of the following aspects in shaping their personal identity. And something that I found really notable here is that white voters overall tend to find these markers to be less resonant compared to their Hispanic and Black counterparts. This is most apparent in the issue of race or ethnicity. Only 25% of white voters say that their race is important to them. Compare that to over half of Hispanic voters and nearly 3/4 of Black voters. But that same trend holds true even across things like religion and faith, gender identity, political party, occupation, and so on. What I found interesting when we break the data out further as well is that we see that Black and Hispanic voters of color are also more likely to feel that those who share their demographic identities are being overlooked compared to white voters. So, in addition to white voters having that lower resonance to things like race, age, gender, they also are less likely to believe that they're being overlooked because of those characteristics. Once again, this issue of race or ethnic background shows a very stark picture. Nearly 3/4 of Black respondents say that people who share their racial or ethnic background are being overlooked, compared to just 33% of white voters. But something that I found as well is this also divides by age. So when we're looking at the younger cohort of voters, 18 to 49, versus a cohort of voters who are 50 and older, it's that younger generation who has a stronger sense of being overlooked in all of these different identities. And this holds true across the three groups. So even though, for example, both majorities of Black Americans, regardless of whether they're under 50 or over 50, feel that people who share their racial or ethnic background are being overlooked. That's 8 in 10 of those under 50 compared to just 65% of those over 50. So we're seeing this trend of younger folks, regardless of their race, feeling more marginalized because of their identities. We also ask this question to get a sense of how people are interacting in their communities, of just getting a baseline of how do voters spend their day-to-day lives. And we see that overall, white voters are slightly more likely to participate in different types of personal activities, including, hobbies, activities related to health, local activities, volunteering, political activities. But the other key takeaway that I really want to stress here is outside of, very simple things like hobby, recreation, or social activity, there is minority participation in a lot of these different activities in community life. So the next most selected activity, religious or faith-based activities, only 38% of respondents say that they participate in that. Similarly, only 28% of voters say that they actively volunteer in the past 12 months. Only 31% said that they did local or neighborhood activities in the past 12 months. So we're seeing a lot of low, not just civic engagement, but social engagement as well. And I wanted to take a look at religion one more time. So again, we have that about 38 to 40% of the sample who does say that they participate in religious activities. And we see that that group of voter, those religiously active voters, are also more likely to participate in other community activities overall. So where that is especially stark is in volunteering. So we see that both white, Hispanic, and Black folks who are religiously active are much more likely to be volunteering than those who aren't religiously active. But this same trend applies to arts and culture activities, local community or neighborhood activities, so on and so forth. The only place where that rule is actually broken is when it comes to political activities, where we're seeing pretty equal participation among voters in political activities, regardless of whether or not they are participating in religious life or faith. The other thing that we did is asked a series of agree disagree questions to sort of get at voters' sense of community, their sense of value, their sense of authenticity, individuality. And we saw that many Southern respondents or these voters felt a strong sense of connection to community. We see 59% say that they feel emotionally connected to their community. But once again, we see a minority are active participants. Only 44% say that they are involved in events like clubs, volunteer groups. The other thing I really want to point out too is that we see just over a third, 35%, say that they feel unable to influence decision making within their local community. While that number isn't incredibly high, it is notable that we have such a strong portion of voters, basically one in three, feeling that they don't have a voice in decision making in a local level. We also wanted to ask voters, because this relates deeply to EPU's work of reducing division, reducing tensions, building community, about whether they're discussing issues of politics, issues of fairness, issues of equal opportunity, with folks who are like them or across different viewpoints. And what we do see is that while many voters are saying that they do discuss it often, it's really with like-minded individuals. These conversations are not happening across the aisle in a meaningful way. And I think the next graph really shows this, where we have all the folks who say often, and it seems like, notable portions of the population say that they talk about politics with like-minded people, they talk about fairness and equal opportunity with like-minded people, but those numbers quickly drop when it's about talking with folks who have opinions who are different from their own. The other thing that I think is notable is that overall, Black voters are slightly more likely to be having these conversations, with the exception of this talking about politics with like-minded people. That is something that white voters are doing much more frequently than voters of color. But when it comes to these other things, such as speaking up when a family member says something racist or sexist, or talking about themes of fairness and equal opportunity, we're seeing higher rates of that among Black voters. The other thing that I saw that was really interesting is that if we're looking at both race and gender among our white group and our Hispanic group specifically, we see that it is the women of those groups who are more likely than the men of those groups to be participating in these conversations around politics, equity, fairness, things like that. I think the difference is particularly stark between white women and white men. For example, 49% of white women say that they frequently or often speak up when a family member says something racist, sexist, or unjust, compared to just 29% of white men. Similarly, white women are 10 points more likely to talk about politics with like-minded people than white men. We see similar trends with Hispanic women and men, where Hispanic women are slightly more likely or more likely than their male counterparts to be engaging in these conversations. But that trend really breaks with our Black voters. We don't see a lot of discernible difference between Black women and Black men when they are participating in whether or not they're participating in these conversations with frequency. The last piece that I have here that I want to talk about is engagement and information channels. So there's going to be two sort of ways of looking at this. The first is about malleability of attitudes. One of the things that we've been trying to understand with EPU is where, if, and how people change their minds. And when we ask point blank if someone has changed their stance on a political or social issue, we kind of see this resounding no. What really stuck out to me is how unified all of our three groups are. Across the board, 76% of voters in each group say that they have not changed their mind in the past year. When we look at this split out by age, which was a little messy, so I decided not to create the visual, we do see that voters, regardless of racial group, who are in that 18 to 49 range, but particularly the 18 to 34 range, are the most likely to say that they've changed their mind, while older voters are much more calcified. But even still, we're seeing very, very low percentages of folks who will admit to having their minds changed on a political or social issue in the past year. But among this 18% of the sample, we wanted to figure out what was that inflection point that caused them to change their mind. And what we're seeing is it's direct personal experience. So the most common reason for a change of mind is personal experience or direct impact from an issue, followed by witnessing a broad societal or community impact of the issue. And we're seeing that across the racial ethnic groups. The one difference here that I find really interesting that I still haven't understood why this is the case is we see that a majority of white voters, 54%, say that seeing compelling statistical or factual evidence was the reason for the mind change compared to, 35% of Hispanic voters, 39% of Black voters. So this is this outlier among our white voters that we're not seeing among voters of color, that is very compelling to me. The last piece that I wanted to talk about is where folks are going to form an opinion specifically. One of the things that we've been doing with EPU, but also at Embold, we've been trying to focus on in a more broad way is how people are getting their information in this ever-changing news economy and information environment. And what we did here that I thought was really interesting is framing this ask as when forming an opinion. So it's not just about where are you getting your news, but where are you going if you want to get an opinion on something. And we're seeing here that some of the common things are rising to the top: local TV networks, social media like Facebook, YouTube. But there are some really interesting differences across our three groups. One of the notable ones is how Fox News is highly favored by our white voters. That is in part due to, again, that partisan bias we're seeing. Our white voters were the most conservative cohort, and so our conservative voters are turning toward things like Fox News, but also Newsmax, which was another source we tested. But we're also seeing some interesting differences that will become more apparent in the next slide of social media usage. We're seeing that Hispanic and Black voters, especially, are more likely to be getting their information, their opinion forming information on social media and video platforms. So think YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. And what we're going to see in the next slide is that while there is a race factor, there's also this really strong generational factor as well. So I pulled out all of the different social media sources that we tested, or just non-traditional news sources that we tested. And we're seeing that across the different cohorts that we have here, when we're looking at that younger generation versus that older generation, we're seeing a complete difference. So our 18 to 49 group is heavily relying on these new forms of information in a way that their older cohorts are not. This is not necessarily surprising. We sort of already knew this, but I think what is potentially surprising is how we're seeing our Hispanic and Black voters lean, especially these young voters lean especially heavily into video platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram for their news. So, the three main takeaways, I know I moved pretty fast, but the three things that really pulled out to me in this data for the end of 2025 was this sense of pervasive economic strain, while also feeling that opportunity is a limited resource. The second thing that we really saw is this sense of strong community attachment with weaker community involvement. And then the last sort of key takeaway we have here is these information channels being not just a conversation about race, ethnicity, or even partisanship, but also highly generational. So the way that people are forming their opinions is definitely a game of generations. What I'm going to do now is move us to our last slide. We have a QR code on screen if you want to learn more about the work that Change Research does. But also, we want to open up the conversation to have questions both for myself and for Scott and to hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Jessica. It's just riveting. Uh, as someone that lives in the South, I always love seeing data about the South. And I feel like it's a group that often gets overlooked, and is so important when it comes to our elections. I do want to throw one question to Scott. Just because as pollsters, we often don't get to see what you guys do on the ground with this data. So I'd love to just know like what E pluribus unum's like what do you make of all this? Like what are you how are you using this data?
Well, we use it for everything. Data drives everything that we do. But I'll give you an example of how we use the Survey of the South. We are really fortunate to be able to, work with the crew at Embold, but also to work with some really, really smart, informed consultants who help us. One of which is Dr. Roxanne Franklin Lorio, who is someone who really digs deep into the ethnographic part of our work. How's the lived experience? How does this show up? She also was part of the founding team of E Pluribus Unum. So what we do is we go back to folks who are smarter than us. And say, like, what does this tell us? How can we create a narrative campaign? How can we find out something deeper? And a way that we do that is with you all often, which is to go to another level. With this Survey of the South, we ask people to volunteer to do in-depth interviews with the team at Embold so that we can dig deeper into their questions. And one example is when we ask people about moving forward, some groups will have access to fewer opportunities. And when you dig deeper, you often find that they think it's their group who's going to get less, which contradicts some of the way they answered the question or gives us a different nuance. And then we can go back to our consultants who help us shape our narrative campaigns and shape our audience profiles, like Roxanne. And we work with another group called the Together Up Institute, which is more about behavioral science to help shape narrative campaigns, how to shape conversations, workshops, fellowships. So the data really informs us of everything because it shows us where there are places to have leverage.
We have one question from Heidi. They ask, given, I guess, the authors Jacobs and Shea's work, finding that rurality is an identity that transcends geographic and other senses of identity. Could you please share what percentage of people in this sample live in rural areas?
Yeah, so we did actually track urbanicity as one of our components. I unfortunately don't have the actual numbers offhand. That's why you see me looking off to the side of the screen so I can get you those percentages. But the other thing that I think is really interesting here with our Southern voters, especially when we're looking across 13 states, is we often find that with the many demographic factors that we're dealing with, we find that there's a lot of similarities between not only urbanicity and partisanship, which is hard to untangle, but also urbanicity and age. So sometimes what we're seeing is a lot of young voters, especially young white voters in like think about like cities like Nashville, Richmond, Atlanta, where they are much more urban. And so what happens is when we're seeing certain differences, we're still trying to pick apart how much of it is that rural urban divide and how much of it is from maybe partisan ideology or age. As you know, we're looking at these 13 states, and they do have substantial rural populations, but not all rural populations across these 13 states are, similar to each other. So what we can do when we get offline is give you those exact percentages, as this is research that E Pluribus Unum has published. So we can definitely get you that, and I'll keep digging for those exact numbers for you offline.
We have another question. They ask, was the voter engagement in activities in the community disaggregated for socioeconomic ability to engage in outside activities? In other words, did the study ask across categories if participants had time or means to engage in these activities they wanted to? Just didn't, they said that they didn't see the slides closely enough to know if that was answered.
So the short answer here is we don't have a question in this survey that answers, that piece of, time, energy, barriers. However, I think there are two components I want to add nuance to. The first is some things that we didn't show in this presentation is we asked a really in-depth battery of questions trying to understand where and how Southerners are showing up. So if you are doing, for example, hobbies and recreation, like what does that even mean? And we asked a bunch of follow-up questions to sort of piece together, are people, existing in community? Are they really doing activities by themselves? The other thing is we do a lot of other research, not just with E Pluribus Unum, but beyond, when we're looking at not just civic involvement, but those barriers to engagement and the desire for engagement. And often what we see is this pretty notable gap between involvement and the desire to be involved. We've seen some of it in our research with E Pluribus Unum outside the Survey of the South. But generally speaking, on a nationwide scale, when we ask about these voters' barriers, we're always going to see time as the top barrier. Something that I've been pushing for, and we've been doing a lot of work in E Pluribus Unum on this, we've been working together, is when people say time, does it genuinely mean that they are too busy in their day to be participating in these things? Or is it just that they have a different notion of the actual time commitment available, or rather, is it just a prioritization issue rather than a time issue? So while this exact survey instrument doesn't have that question of, what are the barriers, what are the challenges, that is very much present in a lot of the other research that we've been doing here at Change and in Bold.
Another question came in. Can you restate the 13 states included in this survey?
Oh Lord, okay. We work from West Virginia to Florida, over to Texas, back up to West Virginia. So you're talking about Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Still firing on all cylinders.
I guess a question for you, Scott, and also for you, Jessica, is what's a finding that we've done this survey of the South for a couple of years. Like, what's the finding that has surprised you, or something that you just didn't expect to see when the results came in?
Well, for me, I don't know, and I know it's frustrating sometimes when I see this. I go, yeah, yeah, we know all of that. It's the in-depth interviews and like the focus group work that we do that takes us deeper, because we love to see contradictions because that helps us know where we can act. For example, when we ask folks, do you have conversations across differences? Do you believe that you could contribute to contributions, contribute a positive contribution to conversations around race and equity in your community? Something like 70% of the people say, yes, I do. And then a few questions down, which I think this may be the way all surveys are done, but I love that you don't put these questions back to back. So like 3 questions later, we'll say, how often, when was the last time, or how often have you had these conversations? And you'll see like 40% have even had them. So there's a 30% gap between what people perceive and believe they can do versus what they actually do. And that to us is an engagement gap. So we may create an entire campaign, a narrative campaign, across social and maybe through newsletters, things like that, to kind of start closing that gap. And then when we go back and poll, we'll see if it closed. And oftentimes it does. So that for us is like a surprising thing. Contradictions, there are always so many of them in a poll that seems pretty straightforward that people totally contradict themselves. They say, I do this, but then they say, but I've never actually done it, but I want to.
How about you, Jessica? Is there anything that you feel like has stood out in the data?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I definitely agree with Scott. I always find it fascinating when we see these big gaps between the way that voters feel and then their self-reported actions. So something that we saw in this survey is 60% of people, oh wait, no, more than that. It was nearly, I think it was something like 70% of voters said that they were comfortable sharing their opinions with folks who have different points of views than their own. But then when we actually look at, that rate of engagement in conversations with people who have different views, only 20% say that they do that frequently. So we're seeing that big action gap between the perceive, like people say that they're comfortable, but then the reality shows a different story when we ask another question down the line. The other piece that always stands out to me as well, even though, a lot of the work at E Pluribus Unum, rightfully so, I think, sort of takes us away from partisanship. What I've been noticing is that while we do live in an increasingly polarized world, I find that oftentimes that partisan identity sort of fails to capture nuances in a way that we do see pretty stark differences between, for example, white Democrats and white Republicans. But when we're looking across our different racial groups, oftentimes what we're seeing is that white Democrats and Black Hispanic voters are miles apart in ways where we actually see white Republicans holding more similar views to Black and Hispanic Democrats. I think that is most clear when we're looking at those agree disagree statements about opportunity being a zero sum game. White Democrats, very few of them agree with these statements where they believe that folks are going to be left behind or, that opportunity is a zero sum game. But the majority of both Republican and Democrat voters of color find those statements to be true, as well as white Republicans. Maybe the reason behind those beliefs are different, but on paper, the results make it seem as if there is more alignment with those groups. So that is another reason why I think the work that EPU is doing is so important, because partisanship is can be a bit of a red herring when it comes to, well, what are the actual values that Southern voters are holding?
Um, I guess last question. But I guess Scott, like, we've done this a lot of research with you guys. Like, what's the burning question you want to ask next? Like, what do you feel like we should dive into to take this research further?
Well, I think you do take it far for us because you actually, I mean, we talked about one thing that you do. You actually do, I know 3 major surveys that you do for us all the time. And it's the institutional knowledge that you bring helps us kind of start seeing patterns across the different instruments. There'll be questions that we say, like something that you were just talking about, Jessica. We'll ask the question one way here and then take what we've learned from that and kind of rephrase it a little bit in another survey to actually find out that, here is something that makes it more homogenous, or to the earlier question, like this is an economic question. This isn't about access and things like that. It's about opportunity as far as it ties to the economy. So for y'all, you push us a lot, but also for us, it's getting enough people into the conversation as we create these instruments with you all. I know we've had conversations with you that we've had 8 people on the screen trying to decide what the questions are. I know that that's, something that you bring the best. You are always so open to helping us think of the nuance and helping us get a little deeper because it's the depth, I feel, and the nuances that let us really become even more effective in the work. And then so when we do the next survey to see that change happen is so fulfilling. And I think that comes from number one, the long history we have with you all, but also the rigor that you bring to it. So I think you push us plenty.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jessica, for presenting such fascinating data. I guess with that, we will end the webinar, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks.